dig in here, and I'll dig over here, okay?
There's nothing as satisfying as finding fresh ingredients for dinner. These clams are as good as it gets, and they're loaded with flavor and possibilities. Let me share a secret recipe. Discover an ingredient that fires your imagination. Choose other flavors to match. Find the best way to cook them.
Simple is best.
My secret recipe? Cooking without a recipe.
You can do it too. You can do it too.
Gabe and I scored today out on the clam flats. I like to teach him that his food doesn't come out of boxes and trucks all the time. I think it's important that kids get out in nature and see their raw ingredients once in a while. Now, these are the real thing, these clams, so they're covered in sand. It's always a good idea to rinse them off. I don't want a sandy chowder today. And that's, of course, what I'm going to make, a good old-fashioned chowder. And there really is nothing to make in a chowder. It's just flavor-based, the liquid, and the garnish, in this case, the clams. Once you master the basics of a chowder, it's easy to sort of play with it a bit, make it your own. It's not something that you need to follow a recipe for. It's just something you make. These clams are known as soft-shell clams, mainly because the shell is so soft that it'll crack or break easily. See that? Now I'm going to steam these off. Just a little bit of water is all it takes. Just an inch or so down on the bottom of the pot. Really, all you need is enough water in the pot to just burst into steam, and once that steam starts, it encourages the clams to release their own moisture, and before you know it, you've got clam broth. It's really, really simple. Let's get a lid on that puppy and steam away. While I wait, I'll get started on the flavor base for the chowder. Now for that, I'm going to need a couple slices of bacon. It's always traditional to start with some kind of cured pork product when you're starting a chowder, mainly because this is what you'd expect to find in a remote fishing village on the edge of the world. Really, a chowder had to be made with what you had on hand, which would last the winter, could sit on a shelf, stay nice and fresh, no problem. Now here's a little trick. When you've got to crisp up bacon, I like to take a little splash of water, not very much, and add it right into the pot. Once the water evaporates away, the fat is left behind, the bacon rises in temperature, it browns nicely. So I'm just going to give this a few minutes to crisp up, get nice and brown, and while I wait, I'll get my vegetables ready to add to that flavor base. I'm going to use some celery, classic chowder ingredient, and some onions. See how those clams are doing too. Oh yeah, look at that. And once you see that big cloud of steam and you've heated the clams through and they've opened like this, you know that they're cooked. I'm just going to leave them, let them cool down for a few minutes. I'll shuck them in a little while. And then as soon as the bacon crisps like that, it's ready for the vegetables. I'm going to add them now because it'll stop the bacon from browning any further. I don't want to overcook the bacon, nor do I want to brown the vegetables. I want to taste the clams, not brown vegetables. So while I wait, I'm in for a snack. Now, I'm using one cured pork product today here, but I've also got another cured product here. This is one of my favorites, prosciutto. It's actually a fermented ham product. And a classic way to enjoy prosciutto is wrapped around something sweet, anything sweet, in this case, melon. One of my all-time favorite snacks. It's a classic flavor combination. This still has a few minutes. Not sure I'm going to finish this chowder up yet, but I got a feeling I'm going to be doing some shucking here pretty soon. Gabe and I went clam digging today. It was his first time and he had a blast. We came home with a full bucket, more than enough to make a simple chowder for dinner. I rinsed the clams well, then steamed them just until they opened and released their broth. I began the flavor base with bacon. I rendered it crisp, and then used the flavorful fat to soften the onions and celery. Clam shucking is actually really simple. Just pop it open, and the only part you have to remove is the part that covers the foot, the neck. This long, sort of tough part that sticks out from the clam. See how that just slides right off of there? Take that off. And there it is, a shucked clam. Nothing to it. Now I'm shucking it in a strainer so that any of the broth that strains off is captured into the bowl underneath. I don't want to lose even one drop of this broth because there's a ton of flavor in it. It's perfectly okay to use a canned clam. In fact, all winter long I use canned clams. There's nothing wrong with them. Now I'm going to add these to the chowder at the dead last second, just before I serve it. All I'm going to do is reheat them. I don't want those clams to be too chewy. Add them at the last second. And all this broth that was left behind, there's part of my liquid flavor right there. Just pour that in. Look, there's a lot of sand left behind in the pot, so this is why you've got to use a strainer. And this really is the base to the chowder. And you get a good clam broth when you buy canned clams. The broth that the clams come in tastes perfectly good. So there's my first liquid. Now I need a couple more liquids. I'm going to use a little bit of Riesling, my favorite cooking wine. It's got a nice crisp acidity to it. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And now the biggest decision of all when you're making a chowder. Is it dairy-based? Is it tomato-based? If you were in Manhattan, it would be tomato-based. But here in the Maritimes, we stick to a dairy-based, New England style. And that is milk, cream, whatever kind of dairy you have on hand. I prefer milk, just a nice light milk. It doesn't take very much. There's another type of dairy that we use a lot of here in the Maritimes, and I learned this one from Rachel. This is evaporated milk. She grew up on a remote island in the Bay of Fundy, Grand Manan Island, and it's the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to find dairy cows. So this is how they had to bring their milk in, evaporated milk. I actually never used evaporated milk in my chowders until I met Rachel, but now it's part of our family tradition. But the point is, you can use whatever dairy you happen to have on hand. Don't sweat it. And now I can add the clam broth back to it. Here we go. And just for kicks, I'll strain it one more time. Now that I have my liquid base put together, it's a little bit thin. I'm going to need to thicken it somehow. This is what's traditional here in the Maritimes, a good old baking potato. There are lots of different types of potatoes out there, every one of them with a unique texture and a unique flavor, and they all taste great. And when you understand that they fall into two basic families, it gets really easy to cook with them. On one end of the spectrum, you've got your low-starch, boiling, waxy type potatoes. These are potatoes that hold their shape very, very well, even when roasted. When they're mashed, though, they just crumble and end up lumpy. On the other end of the scale, we have high-starch, baking, floury type potatoes. Potatoes that don't hold their shape very well at all. That's why they're so good when you bake them, because you scoop out that creamy, beautiful flesh. Also perfect for mashing and good for the chowder because they'll break down so easily. To save a little time, I'm simply going to grate the potato directly into the chowder. Very simple. One day when I was sitting in cooking school listening to the instructor explain the traditions of chowder, all I could think to myself was, well, why don't you just grate the potato and speed up the process? And that's exactly what I'm doing. By grating this potato, it's obviously going to dissolve a whole lot faster into the chowder. There we go. And now I simply let it simmer until it thickens up, and it'll take only a few minutes. And that's enough time to aromatize with some herbs. Let's see what we have. I'm going to use some fresh thyme and some bay leaves. And those will aromatize nicely. Just a couple of bay leaves. They've got that wonderful savory sort of underpinning flavor, nice and flavorful. and the thyme. And I'm just going to actually throw the whole thing right in. I'll fish them out before I serve it. And while that chowder simmers, I've got time to bang out a batch of biscuits. In my house, if you're making chowder, you've got to make biscuits to go with it. Something to dip in the chowder. So I'll need some flour, some baking powder, a little bit of salt, a bowl, and my secret ingredient, frozen butter. Here's how it works. Start with 2 cups of flour, about a tablespoon or so of baking powder, teaspoon of salt, and now the frozen butter. When you're making biscuits, the whole key to making them fluffy and getting them to poof up in the oven is making sure that the butter is cut into the flour yet stays distinct. In other words, you should have all these tiny little pieces of butter within the flour instead of having the butter and the flour combine into a paste of sorts. You don't want that to happen because then the biscuits won't poof up on you. I'm using 1 stick of butter, so that's about 4 ounces of butter, or 8 tablespoons if you like to measure that way. Usually takes just under a full cup of milk to pull this batch of biscuits together. And now I'll just mix this together. Notice I'm using the wrong end of my spoon. I don't want to work this too much right now. I'm just seeing whether it comes together into a nice dough, and it does. Just roll this out on my cutting board. With a little bit of pepper on top and just the slightest bit more of salt sprinkled on top of them. And by popping these into a 400-degree oven for about 10 minutes or so, I'll encourage the butter in all those tiny little chambers within each biscuit to melt slightly, release its moisture, and explode into steam. And that explosion, that quick heat, is what causes a biscuit to rise. And you know, I save so much time by grating that butter. Now I've got time to make something else to go with this chowder. Gabe and I came home from digging in the mud with a full bucket of clams. I set to work making a clam chowder. I made a flavor base of crisp bacon, onions, and celery. For liquids, I chose milk and added evaporated milk for extra richness. For a starch, I stirred in grated baking potatoes. I further aromatized the works with thyme and bay leaf. And it's smelling good. It's thickened up nicely too. Those potatoes really work. It's a good time-saving step too. But those biscuits are ready by now. Look at that, beautiful. Now have I got a topping for these? This was my signature brown butter from my restaurant days. I invented this years ago one day, just looking for something to spread on bread. And as it turned out, it was the best thing I ever came up with. And it's really simple to make.
Begin with a stick of melted butter. Simmer long enough to evaporate its moisture content, allowing the remaining butter fat to rise in temperature. As it does, the butter's sugar will brown and aromatize. When it turns a rich golden brown, pour each and every drop into another container to quickly cool it and stop further browning. Meanwhile, whip 2 more sticks of butter until fluffy. Then add the chilled brown butter to them.
Decadent. That's what I call butter, fully realized. I gotta make a salad. I'm pretty sure I have some greens in here somewhere. See what's in the stash today. Bib lettuce, leaf lettuce. It's looking a little droopy there. How's that one? But that's my salad tonight. I better freshen those up. It's actually very, very simple. I know that many of us try to crisp lettuces in ice water, but that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is with room temperature water. I can hear you now. Has this guy lost his rocker? He's going to put that perfectly good lettuce into warm water? You bet I am. And here's what happens. Just tear it off, put your leaves right in, and imagine with me this. Each and every one of those leaves is covered with a network of tiny little holes. And those holes, the pores, allow the warm water to flow into the leaf and swell up every single cell within the leaf. I'm just going to give this a few minutes to soak up some of that warm water. Time for a vinaigrette. I start with a basic vinegar, and there's so many to choose from. I've got a red wine vinegar, I've got a white wine with tarragon in it, raspberry, red sherry. In fact, that reminds me, I used to make a sherry maple vinaigrette in the restaurant that worked really well. Because for me, the rule is this. You start with 1 part vinegar, and you add 3 parts of everything else to it. And that 3 parts, of course, includes the oil, and sometimes something sweet, something to balance off the sourness of the vinegar, like maple syrup. Sherry maple vinaigrette. Where's my olive oil? There it is. And I'm also going to use a mustard with this particular vinaigrette, mainly because I want to combine the oil and the water into one nice smooth vinaigrette. You've got to use mustard to pull that off, though, because mustard has a particular compound in it known as lecithin that encourages oil and water to combine easily. Let's start with the sherry vinegar. And add about 1 part of this to the bottom. 1 part maple syrup. And this is a place to use the best olive oil you have in the house. Tiny bit of mustard. Don't forget to put a little salt and pepper in too. Smooth. Oh, what a balance. That's the key to a vinaigrette. Lots and lots of balance. And a smooth vinaigrette will coat the leaves better. And these leaves are almost ready to be coated. Now that they've rehydrated and sucked up all that moisture and filled their cells with plenty of water, it's time to crisp them. And now I use the ice cubes. I just dump this water right out. Set the leaves aside for 1 quick second while I create an ice bath. And here's how it works. All those little holes that allowed the water to flow into the lettuce leaf and plump up, as soon as those little holes hit the ice-cold water, they slam shut, sealing the water into the lettuce. It works every time. I want the vinaigrette to stick to the lettuce leaves, and if the lettuce leaves are still wet, the dressing doesn't stick to them. And there we have it. A lettuce leaf, dry as a bone, ready to dip into the vinaigrette. Boy, dinner's shaping up good. Got a nice salad going, some biscuits. The chowder's almost ready for the clams, too. Gabe's first clam chowder's looking good. I can't even tell where the potato ends and the chowder begins anymore. Because I'm almost ready to serve, now I can pop the clams in, and all I have to do is just heat them through. Of course, this chowder could use a little bit of green. And when I make chowder, I always add flat leaf Italian parsley.
My daddy.
Hey, buddy. What's shaking?
Daddy.
Come on up.
Hello,
How's it going?
Daddy.
That's your chowder right there. Your clams are in there.
They're my sandwiches.
Can you stir for me?
Yeah.
Here, set your truck down and grab that big spoon. There you go. Give her the gusto. Big circles. Looks good, huh? Are you hungry?
Yeah, I'm hungry.
Okay, can you go get Mommy and tell her dinner's almost ready? Thank you.
Mommy.
All right. That chowder is done. And now for the salad. Time to dress these nice crisp greens. Just a little bit there, not too much. Beautiful. Okay. Can't wait to see what Gabe thinks of his first chowder. That's the best part of going hunting for your own clams. You get these great big chunky bits floating in your chowder. Oh yeah. Excellent. You know, this is not just a chowder. This is a creation that began with a great fresh ingredient, Gabe's first clams, and a simple desire to just cook dinner and not get hung up on any particular recipe. Something you can do at home with simple, logical decisions in your kitchen. You'll end up with a meal just as good as this one, and best of all, you'll be able to call it your own.
I haven't.
How would this chowder stack up at home?
Oh, it would pass. Definitely.
Want some salad?
Yes, please.
Cherry maple vinaigrette.
Very good. Do a cheers, Gabe?
Cheers.
Cheers. Here's to Gabe's first clams.